so I will introduce myself. I'm Ariel Liverton, the Deputy Director of COSI, which is the program that organizes this seminar series. You can find more about the program at cosi.colorado.edu. Today we have as our guest speaker Dr. Ann Scherzinger from University of Colorado School of Medicine. She serves as the Chief of the Division of Radiological Sciences, the Department of Radiology at Anschutz Medical Campus in Denver. She brings over 2 decades of image analysis expertise and is a key imaging researcher at the University of Colorado Denver. She directs also C-TRIC, which stands for Colorado Translational Research Imaging Center. She directs the Informatics Core there. Her work is focused on improving the research imaging workflow. So, welcome to the folder.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Let me know if you can't hear me. So what I originally was going to talk about were just basically imaging technologies, but then after talking with Adrian, you mentioned that you might be interested in some of the other things that go on in radiology, and so I thought I'd just go through, like I said, a little bit about imaging, but a bit about some of the other issues that are going on now in the department and in the research arena and the clinical arena. So at first I just wanted to, a lot of people don't know what radiological sciences is. Right now we have a group of 5 of us. Basically we spend about half of our time at University Hospital doing medical physics, which is really supporting the quality control on equipment, radiation safety on equipment, those sorts of issues. And then I also spend part of my time helping the hospital with their informatics, or at least the radiology department with the informatics issues. But we do also have a time to do some research, and so other than myself, who my primary applications they're dwindling as I get older and a lot more administrative work to do. But we do have an MRS specialist, magnetic resonance spectroscopy researcher, Mark Brown, who's been there for quite a while and has interest in mainly neuro-MRS activities as well as muscular MRS. Have just hired a new physicist in nuclear medicine and PET, PET is his specialty. He's interested in enhancing PET images, getting rid of some of the artifacts and images, working on reconstruction algorithms. And then he's just recently developed this interest in stimulated X-ray fluorescence, if anyone wants to talk to him about applications in medicine. Rebecca Marsh is a diagnostic physicist who's strong interest in dose management, as well as some MRI diffusion imaging, which was her PhD project. And then Michael Slawski, who's also focused on diagnostic as well as nuclear medicine and is very interested in equipment evaluation and equipment optimization. So just for anyone who might be interested. And then the second thing, so what do we do at the university? Radiology is all digital now, basically. The hospital is becoming all digital. And so we're just totally interconnected with various systems, and right now we basically have one large information system that contains all the patient information. And the system we use is from a company called EPOCH. And so this is where all the orders get created, everything gets done basically, that's text-based. And then we in radiology generate images, and so they have these systems called PACS, picture archiving and communication systems, that store the images. And what's changing with those is, originally they were kind of like, you think of an electronic file room. Basically everything is numbered and lettered, and you know where it's stored, and you go get it anytime you want. But it's expanded way beyond radiology now, so that other departments a lot of departments do imaging, endoscopy, and all manner of imaging. The ER does a lot of ultrasound. And so we're now working on a massive project of bringing all of the images together. So that's part of what I do, as well as supporting all the image modalities, or my group does. So we have standard x-rays, we have CT, MR, PET, all of the standard imaging modalities to support. And then the last thing that was mentioned was C-TRIC. So we support C-TRIC as well, and C-TRIC is the Colorado Translational Imaging Research Center. I did that backwards, Research Imaging Center. I'm a little dyslexic these days. But basically, as I was mentioning to someone earlier, that the School of Medicine does a lot of imaging research, and there are little plots of imaging all over the campus. And when our new chair was hired about 5 years ago, the dean gave him the directive to bring all of these imaging areas together in order to become more efficient. And basically, you know, when you're out there by yourself, you're doing the administration, you're doing everything related to your imaging, and if you have a few extra days, you don't have time perhaps to bring other researchers in to use it. And so that was his directive. You know, it proved to be, it's extremely expensive, and the next research building that is supposed to be built on our campus, when the funds come in, is supposed to help bring all of these areas together. So right now it's a virtual center. It's on a website. You go to the website, you can click and go down, look at any one of these you want, and little do you know that they're all over campus. But the second thing that C-TRIC did was try to build the use of PET-CT for research. PET is sort of the new molecular imaging modality of the future, and there was very little research going on the School of Medicine campus in that area. And the thought was that we really needed to build it, and let's face it, it was fundable. You know, I mean, that's why you build things a lot of times on campuses, because people can get grants to do it. So we bought a new PET-CT scanner. We set up a radiochemistry lab in C-TRIC, so we hired a radiopharmacist and a radiochemist and a number of PRAs. We bought the hospital cyclotron from them because they weren't really using it, and set up a lab so that we could now produce radiopharmaceuticals that could be used for research purposes. We have, in addition to the human imaging system, this is a human and large animal imaging system. We have another lab run by Natalie Sarkova that is for small animals, mice and rats, basically, with micro-PET, micro-CT, and micro-MR. And then we have a section of image analysis that supports a number of pilot grants that were granted through this C-TRIC mechanism to researchers who had existing funding in an area that would be amenable to adding PET-CT to their list of available imaging modalities. So they would come in and say, well, you know, my colleagues across the world are doing this. I'd like to be able to do it, and we would give them then some pilot funding to be able to image a certain number of patients, provide them the analytic services to analyze the data and report on it, and then hopefully write a better grant. So that's really the what C-TRIC is all about. So if you're interested in you know, PET-CT research and you think there's a great future for it, these pilot grants, I don't believe are limited to our campus, but I should check that. So what about radiology itself? What are its areas of focus? Obviously, quality of care is a big one. Quality of care is kind of what leads us to all of the various imaging modalities that we have and that we create and that we expand on. But the second thing, or almost the most important thing lately, has been the concept of patient safety. Patient safety is a big push throughout the hospital, as you might imagine. But a few years ago, like this is mid-2005, 2006, all these reports came out about radiation injury being caused by CT scanners being overused, or being somebody held the button down too long, or that sort of thing. And so suddenly that became, it really moved up the gamut of being issues that we have to address. And so there's any number of papers and research being done on radiation safety and radiation control. Cost containment. Obviously, you know where that came from. You know, medicine is expensive, radiology is really expensive, so radiology needs to contain costs somehow. And so surprisingly, if you go pick up research journals, there's many articles on cost containment, which is, you know, really not what most of us were trained to even think about, but we do now. And, you know, you'll get many radiologists complaining about it all the time. And then this last thing, meaningful use of health information technology, which the doctors will say means that now we all got to have Facebook accounts. But the reality is everything is digital now, and you can spend a heck of a lot of money on digital. So the question is, what is the most meaningful way to use it, and how are we going to implement it in facilities? So I kind of want to go through a little bit of each of those to give you some ideas of the problems that we face and the issues that have to get resolved. So technology is always kind of interesting. Obviously, that's kind of where how most of us got into the field, was because we were interested in the technology and what it could do. I think probably in the last few years, we have not introduced a lot of new modalities to radiology. We're kind of stuck in the standard, in the ones that we've been using for the last 10, 15 years, but we've certainly made a lot of improvements. And probably the biggest one has been in contrast resolution. And and I'll go through a real quick definition of it, and a lot of work with multiple modalities, doing the same thing with multiple modalities and trying to fuse them together in a way to give additional information. In this example, this is, child advocacy and child radiation dose is a big thing. So we've done a lot of work on lowering the dose. This is just a kid playing in what they called the Philips kitten scan instead of the CAT scan, because it was small and you could put a little stuffed animal in it and pretend like you were getting an image of it, just to make them feel comfortable around the modality. And then this whole adjustment to the digital world and all of the new digital things that have to happen. So, contrast resolution, for those who don't know how we think of it, is basically, can you see something if it was there? So if you take a picture of 2 glasses of water, one with sugar and salt, you're not going to know the difference. You can't see anything on your image that tells you that one's sweet and that one's not. But certainly if your detector is your tongue, you're going to tell that really quickly. Now, we don't recommend that, but that is really what contrast resolution is in the mind of a radiologist, is, can I use that modality to actually see a change, to see a pathology? Who cares if everybody looks normal? It's kind of useless methodology. So, I hit the medical students with this a lot, is that we need to know what you're looking for. So that's a new paradigm, is that you don't just order a study anymore, you order it for a specific reason, because that lets us decide how we're going to do it or what we're going to do, in fact. So it's going to vary a lot. So contrast resolution has become a big thing. Now this, it took off, probably the best example in my lifetime of being in the field of the need for this was in MS. When the very first MRs came out, we used to do CT of every MS patient. So CT is a modality, it's an X-ray modality, so it's looking at electron densities. If 2 types of tissue don't have a different electron density, you're not going to see them. And so they would do CTs, and every once in a while for an MS patient, maybe when they got a new lesion, or you would actually see it on the image. But for the most part, it was kind of a benign image, and you could only guess, and if you hit the right time. But then MR came out, and these lesions were just incredibly visible on MR. And it was overnight that MS patients got MRs instead of CTs. But that's just a perfect example. So MR, instead of looking at electron density, is looking at mobile protons in the body. So it's looking at water, it's looking at fat. Those are the only 2 real mobile protons that we see. And so I always tell the medical students, the way you can tell the difference, the best way to tell the difference between an MR and a CT is that because the skull is too hard, you aren't going to see it on MR. But because it's very dense, you're going to see it on CT. So there's a skull is white here, it's black here. Easiest way to discriminate those 2 brain images anyway, or any image with a bone in it, which is, most of your body has a bone somewhere. But basically, that's contrast resolution at its best, is we're looking for modalities and ways of seeing things that we haven't been able to see before. So there's, a lot of work has been done using imaging for research, and one of the ones, and I'm just going to go through just one example of how the research has sort of expanded to use multimodality. Now I do a lot of obesity research, We have a large obesity center on campus, even though we are in Colorado. It's supposed to be the least obese state in the country. We actually have quite a bit of obesity research going on, and a lot of exercise research too, I would say. But one of the first things that years ago, researchers would come to me and say, how do I know how fat somebody is? You can measure their girth, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And so this is just, this work we did years ago, but basically, this is a cut through a real person, and you can see there's a lot of fat, and this is about at L4-5, so it's like lower lumbar region. And there's a lot of fat, which we call sub-Q fat on the outside, and then these are the abdominal muscles. So these are the abs and the lateral abdominal muscles and the back muscles in the back, the psoas muscle. And this is just fat and gut, basically, in the middle at that level. So people have a distribution, but it turned out that the fat in the very center here is much more metabolically active than fat that's subcutaneous. So they wanted to be able to separate the two. Well, the nice thing about CT is it's very quantitative. We go to great pains to calibrate CT scanners so that water is 0 Hounsfield units. It's our calibration, our density number. Fat will be negative. That's why it looks so gray here. Most tissues then are like positive 30, 40, 50, 60. Bone can be 200 to 1,000. So, and they're reasonably well calibrated. Now that's changing for other reasons, but so it's actually very simple to say, okay, here's a range of what fat is expected to be. I can go and pick all the fat out of this image, and then all I have to do is find the abdominal wall and separate the two. And so this is the kind of thing that, we did this for years, and it's fairly simple to do. But you can see how two people with kind of the same girth look quite different inside. And I often say that's a picture of myself I never want to see, but the reality is, we've done thousands of these over the years, and people differ greatly. And so the question is, we use cross-sectional area measurements. The problem with CT is you don't want to do too many cuts because it is radiation, so you do 1 or 2 at most, and then you assume something about the whole body from that. There are issues that complicate it, like if you have some fat in your bowel, then it'll look just like fat. You got to figure out how to eliminate that, those sorts of things. But for the most part, it's fairly easy to do, fairly accurate. And that was nice for a while. And then the question came up, well, what about the liver? Turns out that in obesity, you get fat internally, then you got all this fat in your viscera, and that's one thing that leads to a lot of high glucose levels, et cetera, and problems with diabetes. But what happens to that fat? Well, it ends up, once you get enough fat viscerally, then it goes to your liver, and then your liver starts to get fat. So there are a couple ways of looking at fat in the liver. One is ultrasound. So this is a fatty liver, and the only way you know it is that this is a kidney. So here's the top of the abdomen. You're looking through the liver here. The kidney's sitting behind the liver. And if the parenchyma of the kidney is darker than the sort of overall intensity of the liver, then the liver has fat in it. Now, that's not very quantitative, and ultrasound, unfortunately, is not very quantitative, and that's a huge area of work that needs to be done. And the reality is, it's not quantitative because it was analog until probably 5, 6 years ago. And so, you just had these analog screenshots, basically, to work with. Here's a normal liver and a normal kidney where they're about the same. So that was kind of the thing, oh, okay, you got a fatty liver. Well, then CT came along, and this whole quantitation thing, you could very simply look at a CT and say, well, if this is normal liver, and if you add fat to it, and fat is a lower density, what's going to happen? It's going to lower the density of the liver. So here's a fatty liver, and sure enough, on an exam, it looks a lot darker than a normal liver. And you could quantitate that number. And that was great, and so we did that for a few years and then realized, based on studies that we had done comparing with pathology or that others had done really, that it wasn't very sensitive to small changes. And you had to get up to 30, 40% change, or 30 to 40% fatty liver before you really saw anything super measurable on CT. So for cases of really high fat, that was fine, but for the average people that we were studying, looking for early indication that fat was going to the liver, that wasn't working so well. So then MR, so people started looking at MR, and I apologize, these images are kind of bad. The biggest problem with MR is the non-homogeneity of the magnet. You get these hot spots all over, and it's very problematic. But as long as they stay in the same place, you can deal with them. So now we got MR as a technique. And I told you that MR looks at mobile water and mobile protons, and they're either waters or lipids. But they resonate at 2 different frequencies. So you can take advantage of that. And you can say, if I do an image, a standard image that we would do, trying to get a lot of signal out so we can see a good picture, we would kind of blend and do an imaging time where both the water and the fat signal were in phase. So the way you do MR, and it's probably a little hard to explain, but you basically, you flip your protons so that you let them relax and you measure the relaxation. And you manipulate the frequency that you're flipping them at or reading them at in order to see one of these 2 peaks. But what you can do is you can take an image that includes both the water and the fat signal, and then take an image at another time that includes only the water signal or only the fat signal. And so that way you can just subtract. So basically what we say is we have an in-phase image where this is both water and fat, so it should be the brightest. And then we have an out-of-phase image where we're subtracting the fat signal from the water. And and you can see that what happens is here's a normal person, and there's not much fat, so the change here is like 2 to 3%. Here, this is a person with a fair amount of fat, about 28% fat in their liver, and you can see the gross change when I'm looking at the sum and the difference of the 2 signals. So you start working on ways to manipulate your MR image to be able to give you this information. So now I've got 4 pieces of information about fat. I can look at CT and get a density, an electron density. I can look at ultrasound and get this sort of impedance reflection difference. And I can look at MR and I can actually see the different water and fat lipids. And so you think, well, you should be done at this point. But it turns out there's more things you can do. And this is a new study that we've just done our first subject on. And this is not that subject because I haven't got the images yet. And we're looking at something called brown fat. And brown fat is a special kind of very metabolically active, high energetic fat. And babies have it, neonates have a lot of it, and animals that go into hibernation have a lot of it. So the question is it what keeps them warm when it's cold out, because it generates a lot of heat when you can activate it. And it's a bit unknown or controversial how much adults actually have. But one of the thoughts was that if one could activate the brown fat, because your other fat just stores calories, brown fat uses them. And so if you can activate that brown fat, maybe there's a way to help with weight loss, or maybe it's explaining something about why people lose weight so easily and other people have so much difficulty. And so it turns out, though, that brown fat, because it is highly active, when you inject a radionuclide called FDG, which is the standard PET imaging agent, it will uptake it. And so you can find depots of brown fat that way. So that's what was done in this particular set of images, where you do a PET CT is you do a CT and then you do a PET. And PET has very low resolution, and then you overlay the 2 on top of each other so you can figure out where the signal is. So you inject the radioisotope, there's a lot of brown fat around your neck, or at least that's where a large portion of it is, presumably keeping your head warm when it's cold, I don't know. But if you're an adult, that's the most likely place to find it. And so you can see that the tracer has taken it up. In CT, you don't really see a whole lot there. You don't see it at all. You see a little bit of it. It should be a little darker than the other tissues, but it's kind of hard to find. And then you overlay the 2, and then it's highlighted very nicely. So it's another way of synthesizing PET now with CT. So now I've got PET information as well. So I'd say that what's happening is that we're trying to find ways with multiple modalities to look at things in a research arena and figure out a little more information about them. The hard part about doing this clinically is that every one of these studies costs money, of course. But anyway, so that's one big push. Probably another one that I wanted to talk about is the whole concept of speed. What's happened in the last 5-10 years is sort of time is money. And so the faster you can get patients in and out, the better. Secondly, people tend to move and breathe and do those nasty things. And so if you can image quicker, then you can get around some of those issues. So those are really two of our huge problems in CT imaging or any kind of imaging, is internal motion or patient motion. And so CT is it's an X-ray technique. You lie in this table. There's an X-ray tube inside this that's going around and looking at you from all sides and creating stacks of images that you can scan through. This is the chest here, so this is the upper part of the body, the heart, the chest, and then this is going down through, there's kidneys down here, and the spine, and that back fat, or back muscle and fat, etc. And so originally CT though was only one slice at a time. Take a slice, move, quite a point and shoot kind of technique, which took a lot of time because you went around, then you had to take the tube back, and then you went around again. And that was totally an electrical engineering problem, is the tube rotation, the electronics for it were connected to this long cable that went to the computer. And the cable couldn't continually go around forever. So eventually they developed the slip ring technology and we got around that. But, so any kind of engineering improvements are amazing. So, but what's happened in the last 5-10 years is this concept of multi-slice. So now instead of just that one slice, move the table, take a slice, move the table, we take multiple slices at once. So you've got an X-ray source that can fan out, and you've got a set of rows of detectors. And now we have, the latest scanners are pretty much 64 rows. So you'd have 64 of these, and you can envision, you can do the whole heart in one rotation. And you got it. You can do, and this is why it's so easy to do CT now. In 10 seconds, you can go head to toe. So we've solved the time problem, the time crunch problem, in CT pretty nicely. Of course, it did some things to the reconstruction problem, because now instead of having an image taken straight through and another one taken parallel to it and another one taken parallel, so you could reconstruct these nice parallel slices, you have data acquired at all different angles, and you have to go back afterwards and say, I'm going to take something from that detector and something from that one and that one and that one, because we still create these single slices that are parallel to one another. So it raised a whole lot of work being done on reconstruction algorithms for how to get around the artifacts that are caused by that sort of imaging technology. But it did some really nice things. You can do what they call CT fluoroscopy on the heart. You can basically go around once and acquire frames and just build up more and more frames on one pile around. So in 1 second, you can get a set of images that are separated by a 1/6 of a second just by using part of the data as you're going around. But you do the whole heart in one round. So then after basically a 1 second rotation, you have all information on a gated heart that you can look at, and it's very rapid. And it increases the temporal resolution enough that, first of all, you can get really thin slices. If you look at that, the nice thing about this is that when you get done, you can pretty much create any slice of any thinness that you want. You're not stuck with the point and shoot. You did, like you do a slice that was 1 centimeter wide, you'd move 1 centimeter and do another one, and that's the thickness you had of a slice. Here, you can just go through with this data and cut it any way you want. So between this kind of imaging, spiral imaging, and the speed that you could get, you can get these beautiful 3D images of coronary arteries and look for plaque and blockages and those sorts of things that they do nowadays, instead of the old, which was a 5 millimeter slice, another 5, and then trying to put them together and make some sense out of them. So speed has become a big thing, as we can image a lot faster than we used to. And we can do, with multi-slice in 3 rotations, get enough breath hold images that you can reconstruct them in multiple planes and see very little motion at all. So this is, say, 3 sets of images. Now, I've taken the body and I've reconstructed it in a coronal plane, so it's like you're looking at the body. So these are the ribs sticking out on the side, coming forward towards you. The liver sort of laying out there, the gallbladder, a lot of bowel down in here, heart up here. And then this is from a sagittal view, which is cutting down the side like that. So this is the front of the patient. There's that liver. There's a kidney sitting behind it. Remember in ultrasound, we saw the kidney behind the liver. and then bowel coming in and out here. So you can do these really nice, in fact, you can do cut planes. If you decide you really only care about the spine, you can actually do a curved cut plane and sort of flail the thing out and look at it. So those kinds of techniques have become very nice now that we can get very thin slices very rapidly without motion involved. And then the next thing that happened in CT was, once again, let's look at dual energy. If you look at any tissue, they respond differently to different X-ray energies as far as absorbing the energy. And so if I were to take a tissue and I measured it at 2 different energies and I knew its slope, I could readily identify that tissue. So if you image 20 tissues and each one has a different slope, if I have 2 points on the slope, I can segment those out very nicely. And so that's the new paradigm now, is dual energy CT. You do the image and at the 2 different energies, and you can segment out different tissue types based on their how they change in absorption with different energies. And let's get that. Well, actually, I only wanted to show you, because there's 2 ways of doing it. One is to have 2 opposing tubes. So one tube would be at one energy, the other would be at the other energy, and they rotate around together. And then you just need a set of detectors, that one of which is more sensitive to the lower energy and one of which is more sensitive to the higher energy. The other thing you can do is with one tube is quickly switch between energies as you go around. And of course this little graphic was done by one of the vendors that says that you can go much faster with switching than you can with 2 tubes. So you can imagine what technology they were using. Obviously the switching, because you can do it faster. This was their competitor was doing the dual tube. So I wouldn't put too much stock in those numbers there on the side, but anyway. But the nice thing is from the 2 different energies, you can plot energy 1 versus energy 2 and the different absorptions, and you can find areas where there's a lot of correlation and go through and use that then to pick out the tissues of different tissue types. And you can almost dial in energy. You can say, well, what if I want the energy in the middle? You can predict what the image is going to look like with that energy. Now, why do we care to ever do that? What's happened with that is that there are a lot of artifacts in CT, and one of the big artifacts is if you have 2 very high density materials next to each other, you get this dark area in between because so much absorption of the energy has occurred, and you get very little in between. That's very common for the bladder, when the bladder's sitting up in the pelvis, or anything that's sitting in the pelvis, because you got bone on all the way around it. And it's problematic sometimes. It causes a lot of streak issues and what have you. But if you do your imaging at multiple energies, it turns out that at some energies, some of these artifacts are more notable. So if you go and say, okay, let's predict, or let's look at it at this energy and look at it at this energy and compare the 2, you can say, well, this is the artifact, I'll just get rid of it. So it's another way of getting rid of artifacts as well. So there's a lot of clever things you can do with dual energy kinds of work. But once again, as you've got multiple informations about something, you can do a lot more than just having one piece of data. So I think those are probably the big technology changes, and things like that are going on in most any of the modalities that we use. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about patient safety, because we spent a lot of time, and it's been so hot in the news lately, radiation safety being the primary one. Radiation safety, as I mentioned, a lot of newspaper articles about radiation burns and concerns about too much radiation in radiology. MR is another area. I think that one's probably a little less. When we first got MR, there were all the stories about the buses that ran into the MR scanners because they were attracted by the strong. Those have kind of died away. It's not really that big of a deal anymore. But we still have issues with implants in patients, pacemakers, things like that have gotten some resolution in the last few years. They're starting to make these non-ferromagnetic and non-sensitive to magnetic field devices and what have you. Biggest problem we have now is figuring out which one the person has in them. But basically, that's being handled. Ultrasound safety, interestingly enough, has sort of come into the fray, only because with OB studies, if we do a lot of imaging on OB studies, sometimes in early trimesters, there's some concern about the fetus because of heating issues. And then there are now being introduced some contrast agents to be used, which we've never done in MR before. And contrast agents, in ultrasound, are generally microbubbles. And the thing about ultrasound is it's a mechanical vibrational wave. And if you start bubbles vibrating, they can break and explode and cause bioeffects. And so that's been the issue. Microbubble contrast agents are not FDA approved yet in the United States, though they're well used in Europe at this time. But eventually they will be, and then there's a lot more precautions that we'll have to take. But I'm going to focus on the radiation issues because they've just become so important in our department, in all departments. And where did this come from? The study was done in the early 1980s looking at background radiation and medical radiation. And it was discovered that background radiation is around something called 3 milligrays, just to give you a sort of a number, baseline number, on the average across the world. In Colorado, it's a little higher because we're closer to the sun, but the reality is there is a background radiation that we're all exposed to all the time. Not going to go away. And compared to that, medical was a very low percent, so nobody really worried about it. Well then, CT, multi-slice, 10-second full-body CTs arose. And suddenly, when they redid this study in 2006, suddenly medical and background were pretty equivalent on the average. And so that meant that by having all of this radiation available in radiology or in medical imaging, that we could easily double the dose to the population. Now, these are population doses of radiation. And then there's these others, I don't remember what they are, but obviously they don't change. So there became suddenly a grave concern about, do we really need this?
Sorry, the population contained only people who had CTs or?
No, this is averaged over the entire population.
So some of the people were.
Yeah, and I'll show you some numbers. Yeah, so it's a very small number of people who get most of it. Yeah, if you haven't had one, then you're not one of those people. So then the question was that 50%, or that, what does it come from? So they broke it down, and here's the background 50%, and here's 24% of what's left, and it's CT. So people felt pretty comfortable that CT was the cause of the problem. The other, nuclear medicine, where you get injected with the radioisotope, gives a significant portion. And then something called interventional radiology. And interventional radiology, or any kind of interventional study, is a study where they inject a dye in so they can see a vessel, and then they may put something in that vessel. They use it, cardiology does this as well. They put a stent in a vessel to, if you have a small aneurysm or a small hole, and they want to put a little tube in there to connect your two tubes together when they do their plumbing work. But they do it under guidance of X-ray, or fluoral guidance, which is, fluoral is like real-time X-ray. They turn it on and they just watch things happen. So that's what this is, and that's actually, in some sense, a little more concerning than this, but the reality is most of this was CT. So that's what started the push. And then they looked at it a little more, and so this is the, looking at the CT scans per 1,000 persons in the ER, and from 99 to 2004, and boom, it went right up. And that corresponded with the introduction of multi-slice CT in every ER. You have a motor vehicle accident, you go in the ER, they're just going to whole body CT you to see what broke inside. I mean, it's quick, it's accurate, and if they're under the gun to do something, it's not an unreasonable thing to do, but it was obviously changing the overall population radiation dose. And in fact, the other concern was that this is a plot versus age of CT scans. This is the earlier, this is the latter data. This huge increase was in young adults. And of course, those are the ones you're going to be most concerned about. They haven't had their children yet, or they're having their children, that sort of thing. Us old folk, the reality is that exposure to radiation that causes cancer, the cancer shows up about 20 years later. So you're 80 years old and you have a CT, really? I mean, so it's not, you know, the older you get, the less you worry about that, put it that way. But, you know, certainly in these 20 and 30-year-olds, this is something you need to start thinking about. And so those were two huge areas of concern in the ER. And then, in fact, for hospital inpatients, same thing happened. And the reason for this is because if you go into the hospital and you've had a stroke or you've had some kind of emergent condition, they want to follow you. So we'll have people that get a CT a day for 2 weeks. And that's, you know, this radiation dose is obviously significant. Outpatient didn't change a whole lot. So if you go in once and have one and they say you're fine and you go home, you know, it didn't really seem, but it was the inpatients and the ER patients. And then this is the plot of the scans per patient and the number of patients. So you can see that it's a very few number of patients that have 30 to 50 CT scans. It's, you know, 10 patients that had those 30 to 50, and 100,000 of them up here just had 0 or 1. So it's a very small number of people who are having a lot of this radiation, but averaged over the population, it's equal to the background. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Oh, shoot. Oh, well, sorry. There's something missing here. So one thing that the vendors did immediately is they said, okay, whenever you do a CT of somebody, you do something called a scout, which is kind of like an X-ray of the body. It looks just like an X-ray. It doesn't really look like this, but it's similar to this. So you're doing this X-ray of the area you're going to image. And you can see that if you decide to do the chest, and chest, abdomen, and pelvis is what you'll get if you had a motor vehicle accident. You'll get a chest, abdomen, pelvis CT, because that's where you're going to be broken. I mean, legs or stuff, not a big deal. They go, X-rays will tell you that. But so this is probably one of the more common exams that ever gets done, is to cover this region through the lungs, through the heart, through the liver, et cetera. But it turns out that this is mostly air. So vendors got very bright and they said, we'll do this scout view, and wherever we're going through mostly air, which you can see on an X-ray, we'll cut the dose down because you don't need as much radiation to get an image through air. It doesn't absorb much. So they did this thing called dose modulation, which greatly changed the actual effective dose that you get from a study. So that was step number one, but unfortunately it wasn't enough. I used to have a diagram of how much dose. Basically, around the neck, you get a small amount because it's not very big. Then you get into the chest, it went way down. And then when you get in the abdomen, it starts going up again because you have more tissue there. And then you run into the bones of the pelvis, and that's a problem. And then the second thing, and this is something very new, is new reconstruction techniques. And I told you earlier that in CT, if you have an area like in the middle of the body that really absorbs or basically absorbs all of the radiation, you get these sort of black wings on either side of it. So that was very common if you have any kind of an implant in your body, any kind of metal, any really hard anything in your body. So an iterative reconstruction technique, what it does is it takes the data, it basically, from that data, it does some interpolations to what the image, and then it, depending on the technique or the reconstruction, and most vendors won't tell you exactly what they do because it's all proprietary, but they basically sort of forward project with a little bit of data and then go back and fix the data. And what that does in the long run is, if you want a really pretty picture in CT, you just turn the dose way up. The greater the dose, the prettier the picture, no doubt about it. Now, we don't go for pretty, we go for diagnostic, which doesn't have to be pretty as long as you can see what you need to see to keep the dose down. If they can use these sort of post-processing kind of work on the raw data to make the picture pretty, then we don't have to give as much dose. And so these sort of iterative reconstruction type techniques that have come out just recently have really helped the dose issue. And so this is just a quick example of, for a chest CT, lung CT, you can change, well, let me see, this is the best one. You look at the noise, you don't want to increase the noise because that will decrease your diagnostic ability. With the iterative reconstruction technique, you can actually lower the noise by doing all that iterations. But you can also lower the dose. So now we got lower noise, lower dose images, everybody's happy. So a lot has been done technically to lower the dose. And I think that's been a big push in the technology, is to find ways to lower the dose. Now, what do I mean? Oh, I don't know if I'm kind of running out of time. This really is, we came up with sort of a smart card that gives you an idea for different exams, what is the really risk of the exams. This is another thing, to educate people on what are the doses. And the way risk is typically measured is the increased potential for getting a cancer, because you already have a chance of getting it. Everybody does, whether you ever had radiation or not. And so this is sort of an increased risk, and they rate it risk levels, and they rate it sort of compared to lifetime risks of anything. So a lightning strike, 1 in 100,000 of getting that, that's minimal. Cancer, natural cancer, is a very high risk relative to any of the standard x-rays. And in fact, to most any adult CTs are interventional procedures. Most of them now are in the area of what's considered low to very low risk, but they're still a risk. Until you get to these interventional procedures where they turn the fluoral on a lot, and particularly if you're particularly big, the bigger you are, the harder it is to do to get the x-rays through, so they turn them on a lot more. And you may get up into the moderate risk, but right now risks are considered for CT to be, in most radiology procedures, to be at least less than the risk of dying from lightning, or certainly, more than lightning, less than a motor vehicle accident. So that's kind of where we are. And then this got pushed along by California, who passed a law that said you had to report the radiation dose in the patient medical record for every time they had a study. And that raised a whole nother level of research, basically, because the question is, what do you report? Let's see, do I have time to get through all this? Well, how do we measure dose? We measure it with phantoms. Phantoms are people replacements that never change, i.e. pieces of plastic that kind of look like people, but not really. And most of our phantoms are just big hunks of plastic, especially for measuring dose. And we have two different sizes. We have big people and small people. We have kids and adults. And if they're not, and that's one of the problems. And then we put an ionization chamber in either the center or the edge of it, and we irradiate it with some regular technique. And because, with those multi-slice studies, we're doing actually a whole section of the body, we used to have, well, we still have these 100 millimeter long chambers that would then register all the dose. Except now, with 64 slice scanners, if you're doing 1 millimeter slices, or actually 3 millimeter slices are pretty normal, our coverage is actually larger than this chamber. So that's another problem that's we have to deal with. But basically, you take some sort of average of the radiation that gets absorbed by the two chambers, and you say that's the dose. So if I do this study on an adult who's 32 centimeters and perfectly round and plastic, I know exactly what dose they're getting. That's how accurate it is, and that's the problem. This is the dose that we routinely measure on a scanner, and the only reason we measure it is so that when this scanner was installed, we knew that if we did that basic protocol, it gave us that dose. And when we check it again 2 months later, it better still give the same dose and not a greater dose to the chamber, to the phantom. Now, what they've done with that is they've said, okay, if a patient has that same study with that protocol, they get that dose. Not so true, because patients are not round plastic. They absorb differently. In fact, one of the problems is most patients are actually smaller than a 32 centimeter diameter phantom, so they probably get more. Who knows? They use this for kids. Some kids are bigger than this. They use some vendors use this for kids. Most kids are smaller than that. So these doses that they're reporting in California and now threatening to have the entire country report in the patient medical record are only really relative numbers. They have really we don't understand yet how they relate to real patient dose. And so that's been a huge controversy. There's been a lot of research done on if a person is smaller than the diameter of the thing, how much, what is the multiplication coefficient. So it can they can get up to 3 times or half as much as the dose that we're reporting. So how accurate is that? So that's been a huge problem. I'm going to skip that one. But one thing that's come out of it is these campaigns called Image Wisely and Image Gently, and you know, it's sort of what it is saying, don't do a study unless you really need to do it, and do the one that is the best for what you're trying to find out, but the lowest dose. So the ACR and the RSNA, ACR is American College of Radiology, RSNA is the Radiological Society of North America. We have so many societies, it's amazing. But they've come up with a set of what they call appropriateness criteria. So now we're getting into the informatics of this thing is blown into a huge informatics project where for a given clinical condition, say acute shoulder pain, the first thing you should think of doing, because it has a rating of 9, is an x-ray of the shoulder. And it has a relative radiation level that's pretty small. See how visual this all is? And then if you want to do a CT of the shoulder, that's a really low rating. You shouldn't even think about that. You better have another reason. And in fact, it's much higher radiation. So they've kind of done these ratings for many procedures, and now the push is to get these ratings into the system that the referring physician uses to order a study, so it comes up and says, with those symptoms, this is what you should be ordering. As you can imagine, taking that freedom away from physicians is very difficult. But this is kind of where things are going. And the other I just don't really want to do that. I just want to go, okay. The other thing that's happening is a thing called the Dose Index Registry, which is another informatics project that's come out of the, who does that? ACR, I think that's, I don't know, I do so many of these anymore. But basically, for all of the CTs that you do, you send the dose that you used to a general registry. It's RSNA because it's in Chicago, electronically, of course. And they compare yours to across the country. So here, blue is ours for these spine exams. Green is all the other academic institutions that participate in this. Red is all institutions across the country. And then you can look and say, am I way above somebody? Or am I way below them? Or am I in the right ballpark? So it gives you a way to compare your procedures to what everybody else is doing. Now the big problem with this is nobody calls their procedures these names. So you spend a lot of time mapping your procedures to the names that they give you. And everybody does them differently, so I can't honestly tell you that what I called the CTL spine without IV contrast, having such a low dose is really what this person called it or that person called it. So the informatics world is really lacking for all of this. And then finally, cost containment. Cost containment happened because if you look over 2000 to 2007, and you look at what patients get referred for, it turns out that the largest increase was imaging services, and imaging services are expensive. So either there's something wrong, or they're too expensive, or maybe imaging services are really the best way to go, but we just got to get the price down because the overall cost is getting too expensive. So that study led us into this appropriateness criteria that I showed you that looked at radiation and looked at what a study should be doing, now has a cost parameter to it. So the best thing to do has to do with most accurate at discovering the thing, lowest radiation, lowest cost. And so all those things get factored into these new criteria. So once again, your informatics is trying to figure out how do I sort these out and how do I assign a value. And the unfortunate thing is you're trying to do it in something that I don't consider so much of a science as an art, dealing with people in medicine, because there's, it's very difficult when you're dealing with people and all the other confounding factors that are going on in their lives and their health history. But anyway, that's where we are. And then that final one, meaningful use. This sort of arose from the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the big grant funder. So of course, if it's important to them, it's important to everyone. And also from the Medicare system, who pays a lot of the medical bills. So meaningful use just means that everyone has to have electronic medical records, and you have to have them installed. And there's incentives to actually do it, because you get these big extra bonus payments at the end of the year if you've done what they wanted you to do. And then at some point, i.e. 2015 and 16, they're going to look at what you did and said, if you didn't do all of what we wanted you to do instead of the incentive, now you start getting fined. So it's kind of one of those, we'll give you an incentive to get there, and once you've got there, and if you don't stay there, you're going to get fined. So that's how that happened. And what meaningful use is trying to do is, first of all, force you to capture all your data in some sort of standardized way that you can share it. Now that's one of our big problems, is we don't have a standardized way. We have no standard lexicon for radiology. We're working on one called RadLex, but it's not really there yet. We share lexicons with other people, and in medicine, everybody has their own. So somebody has to at some point decide how they're going to talk to each other. In number 2, now you start exchanging it. So you get these things called health information exchanges. I don't know, our hospital asks you, yours probably will soon, or your doctors will say, is it okay if I put your medical record, your medical information on a central server somewhere in the state of Colorado, so that if you have an accident in Colorado Springs and you go to the hospital, they can put in your name and find out your medical information from your doctor in Denver. And that's really what they're trying to go to. The incentive is to get centralized medical information somehow. And then the third step is to, okay, now let's take all this gathered information and let's improve healthcare by saying, X number of people had this study and they got better, had this drug and got better. That's the drug we're going to use from now on. Medicare won't pay for any other drug. So that's really the long-term goal, is to make healthcare sort of uniform across the country. You read all these articles about, if you're in Mississippi and you have a mastectomy, you don't get to see a plastic surgeon until afterwards to help you. In California, it's the first person you see, and which is the best way to do it, that kind of thing. So those kinds of questions, as well as, drug questions and things like that, are what meaningful use is all about. So it's meaningful use of all this stored information. And then standardization so there's lots of ways of standardizing data. That's our big problem right now, is how we're going to standardize the data. We have DICOM, you've probably heard about it. That's how we share images. DICOM is a special format and a special sharing technique for imaging in medicine. If you don't have a DICOM reader, you can't read DICOM images. Photoshop has one plug-in now, so does OSIRIX, or most any of the freeware ones. We have workflow standardizations that are being worked on by groups. But the problem is that even if I look at a DICOM header, we have a lot of terms that are not standardized, so it speaks to that lexicon. And so it makes it difficult to compare. And there is a lexicon called RadLex, where this is that dose index registry, where I can go back and map what I called something to what they called it. But it's very tedious, sort of a continually ongoing thing. And then when a doctor dictates a report, it's still all free text. So once again, the lexicons that get used, they've come up with sort of standardized templates, and now they got to develop all the lexicons that says, do I call this a left shoulder, or do I call it a shoulder on the left? I mean, it's just amazing. I know the people that worked in genomics for years had to work with natural language processing. Well, we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to get dictations, medical records, et cetera, standardized enough that one can do comparisons more easily. And then finally, out of that, the expectation is that you have this thing called clinical analytics. And so I can, on any given day, say, how long did it take to do a certain study? How long did it take for me to report it and get it to the patient record? And were there any critical events during it? How many contrast agent reactions did I have? Those sorts of things. So you have these nice little dashboard analytics that you can look at that your chairman can look at during the day and say, what's going on down there? You guys are getting way behind. And that, of course, that needs informatics. If you don't have things stored appropriately, you can't really data mine them in the way that they'd like to. And basically, you don't get paid by an insurance company if you don't have analytics, because they want to know that you're being efficient. And that's really what's driving so much of this. And so it's late on the day, and a lot of docs complain all the time that they're becoming experts at non-medicine and not medicine anymore. But that's kind of where it is. That's an ultrasound. We have a lot of OB ultrasounds. Anyway, bye. Yep. Anybody have a?
That's my question. Well, actually, you can say new algorithms to do X-ray type imaging. What is the path to implementing it into reality? Do we have to go through vendors, or we can? Do you, for example, do you have access to the raw data?
Yes and no. If it's for a research project, yeah, we have research agreements with a couple of our vendors that allow us to get access to raw data. It's something that, it used to be easier to do because there weren't as many lawyers. And now, you pretty much, you go to a vendor. Vendors are not allowed to give you money to do certain things, and you're not, there's a lot of that conflict of interest stuff that has to get resolved. But the reality is, Mark Brown, one of the physicists that I showed you, works primarily in MRS, but he also does some pulse programming in MRI. So we have research contracts with our Philips MRI vendor that we have access to the data. In fact, we can even go in and program the machine to do protocols that they don't even do. And we're getting that for our Philips PET CT because of atoms. So it really, if there's an interest from a researcher and it gets vetted by the vendor and it goes through our legal counsel, then we can get research agreements. But it's not, it used to be a lot easier, but there's just too much. If you think about the equipment belongs to the hospital, if you go in there and you do something on it that puts it out of service for 2 days, that's a huge liability to the hospital. So all of those things have to get addressed in these contracts as to who's going to be at fault if something goes down. The nice thing about having the research PET CT is that we don't have the issue of losing a lot of studies yet, as charges and things like that, and we don't have hospital lawyers to deal with. But it can be done, and we do it.
Is the same situation with ultrasound?
Ultrasound's a little harder, not because you can't get it, but sometimes it's because it's not there to get. If you go to, we have a fellow who's working with Philips Ultrasound as well, and he now has a contract with them to be able to get at most of the raw data. But ultrasound, like I said, it wasn't truly digital until 5 years ago or so. And so much of the data never really was in a place that you could get it. But I think it's getting better. An RF shop is entirely Philips Ultrasound, so we think that we have stronger relationships with them. And so it just takes that kind of relationship getting set up and the trust levels and the lawyers.
Multi-source configuration for ultrasound with experience.
Right. And they do, well, certainly for the elasticity, elastography, I guess they call it, and the shear wave stuff. So. I'd have to ask ByAnn. We have, like I said, we have a postdoc, or not a postdoc, a pre-doctoral student who's been working with Philips because he's interested in calculating flow and setting up models for flow in the liver. And so he has access to a lot of the Doppler raw data in order to do that. So it can be done. Oh. We have access to all the image data. What we don't have access to is the string of unprocessed data that actually gets acquired. So if you think of that CT as you're going around, there's probably 1,000 times that tube goes off and 1,000 detections per line through there that happen, and then that forms a sort of sinogram of all the raw data, and then it gets reconstructed into an image. Image is no problem. Sometimes the raw data is. We do pretty good in CT. Most of our vendors have no problem giving us access to that unprocessed CT raw data. The biggest problem is that it's a large amount of data, and typically our systems are set up to hold that data for 5 days before it basically gets thrown out of the queue because new is coming in. And within that 5 days, if there's something we want, we can just go over and get it and dump it onto a flash drive or a CD or something. So CT is easy, MR is a lot harder to get, but with a research contract. Ultrasound is more difficult just because I think it's more difficult and the vendors aren't used to doing it. So.
Thank you really for coming and
Sure. Well, I hope that was what you were hoping for. I don't know.